Like Metroid Prime 2 echoes. Yeah, that's a great opening statement, Critica. Keyword being I didn't. Don't get me wrong, all those years ago I certainly tried to like it, and I even beat it once. When I was a wee lad, I just couldn't get past the whole Dark World gimmick without seeing the inclusion as incredibly frustrating, and I don't think that frustration was entirely baseless. However, after playing it for this critique, I've come to like the game quite a lot, but it's still as clear as ever to me why this game had me so split and hesitant to begin with. As Metroid Prime 2 builds heavily from the foundation set by Metroid Prime 1, I'd highly advise watching my previous video on Prime 1 so that you can have the full context when I refer back to it. Prime 2 improves upon that foundation and executes what the original had been trying to achieve almost perfectly, though it does take a few steps back in my opinion. The beginning of the game sets the tone perfectly. Samus receives a mission from the Galactic Federation asking her to go to the planet Aether to track down their missing troops and find them, and just taking a brief glance at the planet tells you something is up. This, of course, is followed immediately by Samus's ship crashing due to the bizarre lightning storm she passes through on her descent. With a mission to finish and no way back, Samus makes her way into a nearby cave system and soon finds the Federation troops she set out to look for. They're dead, of course. And not just dead, undead, as an unusual substance seizes control of their bodies. Perhaps puppeteered would be a more appropriate statement. For those wondering what the heck is going on, it becomes quickly apparent as you follow the technically newly introduced Dark Samus through an interdimensional portal to a realm where you know only pain. The way they introduce Dark Samus in this game is fucking great too. The whole setup of her going through the Dark World portal would lead most to believe that Dark Samus is our own Samus's Dark World doppelganger. Though, even this early on, Dark Samus demonstrates the strange behavior of drawing energy from pools of Phazon, a plot point that can be easily written off as just being a strange behavior of the denizens of the Dark World. It's by far the best red herring in the entire series, and it sticks to this bit almost the entire way through. Not that this introduction gives Samus, or the player, much time to digest any of that, as before Samus can do anything, Dark Samus destroys her only protection from the poisonous atmosphere of the Dark World, causing her to recoil in pain before having her equipment stolen by the Ing. Honestly, the equipment lost in this game isn't too bad. I'm not entirely sure why they even bothered taking away the missiles, since you can get it back within half an hour anyway. The loss of the Morph Ball bombs is a bit annoying though, but all in all, none of this feels as much of a step back as the beginning of Prime 1. And I say this as someone who was never really bothered by it in that game either. After coming to terms with having lost your abilities, you can work your way to the Galactic Federation ship that they came in on and find that they were slaughtered by Ing-possessed splinters, shadowy versions of the otherwise harmless creatures you've been encountering up to this point. Needless to say, there were no survivors. After fighting off a few of them yourself, you ascend an elevator to the Great Temple and fight the Alpha Splinter. It's kind of an underwhelming fight, but it introduces the more dynamic bosses of this game, where they might get possessed partway through and change up their movesets. It's not complex in this exact instance, but it does make this otherwise simple boss fight more interesting. What I do find fascinating, though, is what it drops. A strange, foreign technology that not even the power suit can decipher. To put things in perspective, up till this point in the series, Samus's power suit has never really had any issues with compatibility. This gives us a glimpse into the limits of its capabilities, as this is the first game in the series in which Samus obtains abilities not created originally by the Chozo. I suppose one could make the case that Fusion did this as well, but in that game the Galactic Federation was trying to replicate Chozo abilities anyway, so I think the point still stands. There's nothing about this I don't love. The introduction of foreign technology means the game can take Samus's power-ups in directions we haven't really seen until now, which is a really exciting prospect that I wish the series would do more often. Incidentally, the technology we just acquired isn't terribly interesting on a mechanical level. It's just an energy transfer module, a MacGuffin, as explained by the resident of the planet we meet shortly thereafter, Umos of the Luminoth, who, incidentally, is the first alien Samus speaks with in the series that actually gets dialogue. That's neat. Umos explains that, much like Talon 4, Aether had been struck by an asteroid that, instead of spreading Phazon, caused a rift in space-time to open. or perhaps more accurately, it's implied to have created an entirely new parallel world. And Umos beseeches Samus to go help them reclaim the light of Aether from dark Aether, to make their world whole again, which Samus wordlessly agrees to. Not like leaving this planet anytime soon is an option. Might as well kill sometime, huh? And that's more or less the setup for the story of this game. I don't usually like to walk through a game's story too much, but I felt it was necessary to highlight just how much of an improvement it was over Prime 1. There's a lot of clarity, and there's still plenty of lore that you can find that goes deeper into all of these different aspects, but on the whole, I find Prime 2 fixes almost all of the issues I had with the narrative delivery in Prime 1. It sets up its premise and goal by showing, not telling. Well, for the most part anyway. Certainly no more than necessary. From here, you set out to Agon Wastes, Torvis Bog, and Sanctuary Fortress, and retrieve the Light of Aether from each respective Dark World. Though, on the subject of the Light of Aether, I did a quick scan of it while I was making my initial visit to the Sanctuary, and it's basically composed of solar, bio, and geothermal energy. And that just leaves me wondering how the loss of any of that energy would have any impact on the dimensional stability of Aether. And even setting aside the space-time stuff, these are all renewable resources, so I don't see how the Aang taking some of it would be a problem. Yes, I know, I'm overthinking it. Coming right off the back of Metroid Prime 1, my immediate impression upon entering Agon Wastes is that having 2 games in a row begin with a desolate wasteland might be a bit of a misstep. However, I just as quickly dismissed those thoughts, as Agon Wastes is quite good at differentiating itself. If Chozo Ruins was meant to be a tranquil spiritual place eroded by the sands of time, Agon Wastes leans much harder into the harsh industrialization and is much more scorched earth than desert. There's a drastic tonal difference, helped in part by the much more bleak color scheme of Agon Wastes, coupled with the red and rusty tones of the Luminoth structures. It's dreary and oppressive. While I won't be talking about the temple grounds much, up until this point, Prime 2 has done much more to make unique alien structures and geographies than the much more standard environments that made up the bulk of Prime 1. And one of the little touches I really like about the wastes are the bolts of lightning that occasionally strike down. I didn't really have anywhere else to work this into the video, I just wanted to include it because it's cute. Progression in Agon Wastes is interesting. It starts with the wastes and their accompanying Luminoth facilities, and makes way for a space pirate base that's been set up to harvest Phazon from Dark Aether. And speaking of Dark Aether, this is also where Interdimensional Travel is introduced as a proper mechanic, beyond just a tutorial cutscene. Travel can be accomplished by portal devices that open rifts for you to travel through, or by shooting unstable bits of space-time that can only be stabilized portals after being shot by either the light or dark beams respectively. The distinction between the two methods isn't really all that important, however. It's more flavor than anything. At least in regards to Agon Wastes, for reasons I'll get to later. Dark Aether itself is a very bold take on the Dark World trope that seemed to plague games of its time. Typically, a dark world, for the 2 of you that are unfamiliar with this trope, is usually just a dark reflection of our reality for a place that you've already visited. This is pure speculation on my part, but if I had to guess the reason behind this trend, it was probably both an effort to save resources while extending gameplay. But the level design and enemies typically changed just enough that I could never call the trope padding. Dark Aether is fairly distinct among them, as it literally physically hurts you just from being there, on top of the changed up level design and significantly stronger enemies. Dark Aether drains your energy rapidly, meaning environmental awareness and strategic movement are extremely important to survive here. Describing it as I am, it might sound almost insurmountable, but the Luminoth warriors who came before left a variety of light crystals and beacons which act as protective barriers against the hostile atmosphere, as well as means to recover health. I like the idea of having to dart from barrier to barrier quite a lot, but I do find myself a bit mixed on the healing effect it provides. It's almost certainly just a way to avoid soft-locking someone from being at low HP, but I think it could have benefited from being slightly more conditional. Like, maybe only recovering energy if you're down to your last energy tank or something. Overall, I think the execution is really good, and even with the healing, the toxic atmosphere and barriers add a lot of tension to the exploration that I haven't really seen in any Metroid games before or since. Dark Aether wouldn't be able to build that much tension with just the literally deadly atmosphere alone. It needs its denizens, the Aang, pentapedal shadow creatures that can manifest extra-dimensional energies to attack from range, and can possess living and non-living things by puppeteering them to their own wills. A formidable, relentless foe that only wants for violence and death for anything that isn't them. They even attempt to possess Samus, only failing because apparently the energy transfer module that she obtained protects her from them. This happens during gameplay, mind you. While the Warrior Aang, which are probably their most iconic form, are fairly uninteresting to fight due to them being mostly just damage sponges, I still think all of their demonstrated capabilities make them an intimidating force to be reckoned with, narratively speaking. Visually, there's not a whole lot to say about Dark Agon Waste specifically. Aesthetically, it's just as dreary and depressive as its Light World counterpart. More so, perhaps, given the aggressively damaging atmosphere tints your vision red just for walking through it, and the sky pulsating with purple energy. If there's one thing I really like about Dark Agon Waste, it's the attention to detail with the space pirate base. Although, of course, to talk about that, we first need to talk about the Light World space pirate base, which is the first and last pirate base you'll find on Aether. From a design perspective, it seems like this was placed here with the intent of inverting the area progression of Metroid Prime 1, stacking the odds against you immediately by having you face an entire pirate base at the beginning rather than the end, like the last game. But it also seems to highlight just how threatening the Aang and Dark Samus are, as it demonstrates just how powerless they are to stop them. Compared to the pirate bases of Prime 1, the Agon Waste Outpost has a fairly simple layout and isn't really worth talking about from a level design perspective. More importantly, this base acts as the Space Pirates' base of operations for entering Dark Aether for its Phazon deposits, which in itself wouldn't be terribly interesting aside from this really cool attention to detail, wherein since the Space Pirates outpost wasn't present during the formation of Dark Aether, there is no facility when you go there. Instead, when you're in Dark Aether's version of this facility, you're just in an empty cave system that it was built into in Light Aether. It's an amazing attention to detail I almost didn't notice because it was so subtle. And it makes so much sense. Realizing that not everything is directly mirrored on Dark Aether also might draw attention to the possibility that Dark Samus is not a denizen of that world. God, I just fucking love everything about this. It has Metroids too. Admittedly, this is probably the most forced their inclusion has felt in the trilogy, as they only seem to be there so the lore can make hints about Dark Samus's true nature, as she's frequently reported having broken into the outpost to steal Phazon and free the Metroids from containment. And I suppose they can also illustrate the threat of the Aang further by highlighting how not even Metroids are immune to their ability to possess things. On the mechanical side of things, this place serves as your introduction to not one, but two beam weapons, Light and Dark. Yeah, you're not surprised by that, I brought them up earlier. The Light and Dark beams are effectively just reskins of the Plasma and Ice beams from Prime 1, with the added benefit of dealing increased damage against creatures from the world of their opposite namesake, Light versus Dark, etc. The thing I keep going back and forth on with these beams is their requirement of ammo. Yeah, you heard me right, beam ammo in my Metroid. With the increased damage the beams deal, I can understand the sentiment of trying to keep the player from over-relying on them by setting an ammo limit. I can't even really fault the decision, honestly. But at the same time, the beam ammo is so easy to refill that I'm not entirely sure why they even bothered limiting it. The decision also kind of undermined the unique qualities of the beams, basically making the freezing effects of the dark beam and the damage over time of the light beam basically worthless. I don't know if I have a definitive take on this, as I see both the pros and cons of the decision. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Look, I know I skipped over talking about the boss fights in Metroid Prime 1, but I just want you to understand, they're not good. Anyway, Metroid Prime 2 is a huge step up in the boss fight quality and quantity. Granted, most of them are mini-bosses and Dark Samus, but nonetheless, without going into the nitty-gritty of every single one of the 17 bosses in Metroid Prime 2, generally speaking, all of them rely on different phases, similar to how the Metroid Prime and its core in Prime 1 did. About half the bosses in Prime 2 feature a light phase and a dark phase, which change up their attack patterns and sometimes their weak points. Even Dark Samus. Though there are, of course, several creatures that don't follow this trend, and the shifts aren't as immediately obvious because of it. The Dark Samus encounter in Agon Waste is pretty decent. She's not an overwhelming force like the SAX from Fusion by any stretch of the imagination, but she still makes for an interesting foil to Samus. While Samus is a slow and calculating individual, Dark Samus much prefers high mobility and attacking recklessly, preferring to overpower her opponents with raw force, and a healthy dose of radiation. This fight starts off fairly straightforward, exchanging blows while dodging in and out of cover, but as the fight goes on, Dark Samus charges with Phazon and begins destroying the cover you've been using, and she begins generating a barrier that leaves her only vulnerable to attacks after she's done her own big ones. It flips the battle on its head, putting you on the defensive while stripping you of your ability to use the environment to your advantage. It's not the most standout fight in the game, but it's definitely an impactful encounter. I'll omit talking about most of the mini-bosses after this, but Dark Samus kind of has to be an exception since she's a reoccurring antagonist. The Energy Control Guardians will be my core focus moving forward since I think they're among the best fights in the Metroid series. The Guardian of Agon Waste is Amorbus, giant wiggly triplets dead set on defending their big ball of concentrated dark matter. The first phase of the fight is heavily derivative of Lanmola from the Zelda series, strangely, attacking Amorbus at range while waiting for it to emerge from the surrounding sands. The comparison more or less ends there, as after dealing enough damage to Amorbus, it attaches to the Dark Sphere and you attack it a bit more by rolling into its mouth and dropping a few bombs. The rest of the fight repeats this strategy with its additional siblings. The Lanmola phase can get increasingly tedious as a result, but I think the fight does a good job at keeping things tense. Having the fight in Dark Aether and lacking much protection, a lot of the fight involves getting in hits while you can, while darting from barrier to barrier. It is admittedly pretty easy to stay in the same barrier throughout the fight, but as their numbers increase, I do think it encourages more proactive behavior. The fight won't blow you out of the water, but it's a lot more engaging than anything Prime 1 had to offer. Okay, I'm done harping on Prime 1. With Amorbus defeated, the Dark Sphere they latched onto shatters and reveals a new power-up, the Dark Suit. And the Dark Suit is really damn cool. It's the first non-Chozo version of the power suit in the series, and it takes on the visual traits of the Luminoth technology we've been seeing up until this point. I like this suit a lot, not solely because it's something other than Chozo tech, but because it's something different in general. Different mechanics, wildly different designs. I love the Metroid series, but even I find myself getting aggravated by the over-reliance on the Varia and Gravity suits. All the Dark Suit does is greatly decrease damage taken while on Dark Aether, but nonetheless, it's a welcome change-up. Gotta say, it is nice being able to explore Dark Aether from here on out without having to concern myself with rushing from cover to cover. Much as I like it as an introduction to Dark Aether's hostile environment, I think the point has been well established by this point as to just how dangerous it is there. So, from here on we can just move on to exploring it properly, and it's quite liberating. It's just unfortunate that Torvis had to bog down the whole experience. It's probably the lowest point of the game for me, and over the decades, it's usually the point where I've stopped playing. But I think I finally pinned down the root cause of that falling out. Torvis Bog starts off well enough. Being a flooded forest, it's at least aesthetically a rehash of Talon Overworld with more muted colors. But it has more fleshed out level design. Granted, I enjoy exploring the bog quite a lot more compared to Talon Overworld. It actually challenges you. The plant life and scenery feel a lot more alien than Prime 1 as well. Dark Torvus does a lot of legwork compared to Agon Waste in making itself distinct from its Light World counterpart, and it really sticks out in my mind as a result. It replaces all of the water with pools of poison, which, it's kind of okay. But that's not what makes it special to me. It's the eyes, the glowing red eyes spreading across Torvus over vast swarms of tendrils, staring, observing, as though Yog-Sothoth has descended upon dark aether.
What madness is this?
Okay, I got a bit carried away there, but I think that's an apt description. Honestly, if this was all there was to it, Torvus Bog would be pretty much perfect. But alas, it's all downhill from here. Well, not downhill, down a singular elevator shaft that connects the upper Torvus to the submerged level below, where the industrialization begins. I like the submerged area, ? Like, the level design is fine, but my problem is how it connects to the rest of Torvus. I think the biggest problem with Torvus Bog is how much of a pace breaker this section is. It funnels you into one elevator that runs between this area and the rest of the level. It doesn't really connect anywhere in any meaningful way. If you want to go back there later on in the game, which you will if you're after 100% completion, it turns into a chore. Thankfully, after that, there's only one other pace breaker, which, some might argue is worse, and we'll get to it. Oh, and Dark Samus shows up at one point here to laugh at you. Did they intend to have a fight against her here at one point? Because otherwise, that's just a really bizarre inclusion. I do find it pretty funny, though. The Temple Guardian of Dark Torvus is Trika. The fight starts against a giant larva in its initial form, which largely involves standing precariously on a large balancing platform while waiting for the larva to emerge and tilt the arena toward it so that you can stun it and attack its weak point. I like the phase in theory, but I found it a bit tedious. Maybe it's the HP pool of the boss, but I felt it dragged on a bit too long. Trika's Dragonfly form is a lot more interesting. The arena actually splits into multiple segments, and the fight revolves around immobilizing Trika and utilizing grappling points to get behind it and destroy the wings. This phase involves a lot of mobility for both Samus and Trika. Trika has an additional phase in the Dragonfly form where it summons minions, but honestly, it's so ludicrously easy to deal with that it's not really worth talking about in depth. You know what else doesn't have much depth? Sanctuary Fortress. What? Don't leave. Don't leave. I mean it literally, not figuratively. Sanctuary Fortress is built atop a mountain overlooking a city, and it's honestly one of my favorite locations in the entire Metroid series. It really stands out as being the only entirely non-naturalistic location in the game. We're going full cyberpunk with this one. You know what? That's not enough gushing. I fucking adore Sanctuary Fortress. The neon blue cyber aesthetic, just fuels me in a way that few games do. And it was one of the areas from this game that I remember loving in my childhood. So I was really looking forward to coming back here, and it didn't disappoint. And this isn't just limited to light aether. Dark aether's got a chilling, bright crimson that bleeds through the entire stage. The Enghive, as it's called. I find the differences between the two not as striking as some of the other areas on anything other than the palette level, but I do find I enjoy this level on the whole much more than anywhere else in the game. I really can't fully express my love for this place. It doesn't just apply to the level itself, but its enemies as well. From Eng Smashers that give me some serious H.R. Geiger vibes in their organic appearance, to my personal favorite, the Resbit. They cycle through a number of patterns, but by far the most striking thing they do is attack your heads-up display directly, forcing Samus to reboot her power suit, which is just awesome. The visual effect as the visor goes haywire, ruining visibility outside and completely disarming you, is an effect that I wish had come up more often. You even get to see the suit run through a boot sequence. I love it. Though, despite it being my favorite level in the game, I don't actually have a whole lot to say about the level design itself. It's fantastic, The fortress is an intricate web that weaves in and out of itself, allowing for multiple access points across the level both vertically and horizontally, with an extra layer of complexity with Dark Aether as usual. It has none of the pitfalls of Torvus Bog's level design. I'm honestly hard-pressed to come up with any real criticisms for it. I got lost many times while trying to navigate the stage, but that's more my fault than any fault of the game's. And that's large part because of Dark Aether just getting my memories all jumbled up. But, it is what it is. The only real bone I have to pick with the fortress is the Spider Guardian. This is more for the GameCube controls than anything, but having a time-sensitive bomb jumping challenge is a bit of a pain, and resulted in a few game overs on my part. I'm aware that the Wii version features a Morph Ball jump for Prime 1 and 2 that can probably make this easier, but the criticism still stands for the GameCube version. Now I'm going to backpedal for a second and talk about the Boost Guardian, since I'm sure some people are wondering why I didn't bring it up earlier. Simply put, the fight didn't really bother me. It hits hard, but that's about it, and according to those that played the PAL and Wii versions of the game, it's not even a problem in those iterations. Then, unlike the Spider Guardian, the battle isn't against the controls. I do have another gripe, though. Y'all remember how I made a big thing about visors in Prime 1 and how well they were implemented? Well, I don't think the implementation in Prime 2 is quite as sound. Though there is a visor that does involve sound. Let's get some of the good out of the way first. They fixed the one nitpick most people had with the scan visor, providing a colored outline for scannable objects in place of a small square, like Prime 1. Not a huge improvement, but appreciated. I wouldn't call my problems with the Dark and Echo visors overtly negative. The Dark Visor fills a similar role to the Thermal Visor, but with worse execution, and the Echo Visor similarly with the X-Ray Visor. I think a lot of this comes down to how intuitive they are to use, and the difficulty in finding situations to use them. Thermal and Dark Visor serve a similar purpose of tracking enemies that might otherwise be hard to see. More accurately, I might say that the Dark Visor kind of hybridizes both the Thermal and X-Ray Visors from the previous game, filling the role of seeing all invisible enemies and platforms. It serves a role when fighting Dark Commandos, the worst enemy in the game, but that's usually about it. Which, it's fine. But the Dark Visor has an issue of making anything that isn't an enemy or invisible kind of blur together in the background in shades of gray and black, making maintaining situational awareness in combat very difficult, to the point where it almost feels like you shouldn't be using it in the combat scenarios that call for it. I also have a gripe with how it's not as immediately intuitive as its predecessors. With names like Thermal and X-Ray Visors, you can more or less figure out how they're intended to function from the names alone, and the same kind of extends to the Echo Visor as well. But seriously, what does the name Dark Visor tell you about it? It's supposed to track creatures and objects that are in dimensional flux, but nothing about the name would indicate that outside of its interactions with the aforementioned Dark Commandos. I suppose I like the Dark Visor more than I like the Echo Visor, at least in terms of usability. The Echo Visor is sonar. It turns Samus into a shitty version of Daredevil. It's only really useful for unlocking doors and very specific combat encounters, namely Quadraxis and Dark Samus. It's a really rad visual effect, but it just isn't very useful. Using it during exploration is almost completely detrimental, and I honestly can't think of any time I felt any desire to use it unless I scanned something that explicitly stated a requirement. I know I said in the previous video that having drawbacks was what made the visors of Prime 1 so effective, but I think the drawbacks of the Dark and Echo visors are a bit too strong, to a point where you don't even want to use them out of curiosity. Thermal Visor could inform you about the temperature of the surrounding area if you were curious, and it was a neat addition. And the X-Ray Visor let you see Samus's finger arrangement for her beams. I've just never found such attention to detail with the visors in Prime 2. Even if the Echo Visor is cool in concept. I don't hate the visors. I just wish they were slightly more useful. Of course, as I mentioned before, one of the more noteworthy uses of the Echo Visor is Quadraxis, who is unequivocally the best boss fight in the entire franchise. Perhaps the most surprising thing is that this fight actually makes the boost ball feel useful beyond half pipes. Admittedly, the boost ball does feel clunky, but it's still satisfying knocking the legs out from under this Colossus. Actually, I'd say the Morphball as a whole gets a lot of love in this fight. Breaking legs in Phase 1, launching onto and bombing the head in Phase 2, through a combination of Spider and Boost Ball. It really highlights the potential combat role of the Morphball in a way that I haven't really seen too much of in the series. It's really hard to sell the quality of the fight just by talking about it. I highly recommend experiencing it for yourself when you get the chance. Is this a cop-out I'm using to get out of elaborating on the fight? Well, with all the energy of Dark Aether's main sectors collected, and the Annihilator beam acquired, it's time to move on to the endgame. But before that, I'd like to have a brief intermission to talk about the power-ups. I gotta admit, much like the Dark Suit, the Light Suit is pretty cool. It somehow looks even more alien than the Dark Suit, or the stripped-down Fusion Suit. Kinda gives me H.R. Geiger vibes again. Let's just ignore that this suit was created solely by infusing the power suit with renewable energy and not actual technology. Not gonna question it at all. As I mentioned earlier, Prime 2 puts a considerable amount of effort into creating new and interesting power-ups for Samus outside of the usual suspects from the 2D games. Got a few stray thoughts to get out there about them. I like that the gravity suit has been reintegrated as the gravity boost. Frankly, I think they should take this approach more often, because it makes more room for interesting suit designs. Not that the gravity boost is too useful in this game. The Seeker missiles are pretty cool in concept, but a bit clunky in application. Not many situations call for them outside of doors, and maybe Trika. Boost Ball was technically introduced in Prime 1, but in that game it was more or less just for half-pipe navigation and not much else. It had an offensive presence in combat, but not enough to ever be useful. Prime 2 reworks the Boost Ball in a few ways. It does the half-pipe stuff still, sure, but there are now a handful of enemies that actually require you use it against them in a head-on fight. Additionally, the Boost Ball can be used to jump while attached to a surface with Spider Ball. I'm not actually sure if that's a new property of the Boost Ball. I don't think it was in Prime 1. But if it was, I never came across any cause to use it in that game. Annihilator Beam is interesting. Okay, that's a lie. It's just a powerful beam with homing properties that consumes both light and dark ammo. I like it, though it's weirdly able to interact with sonic locking mechanisms. Its dual consumption of ammo, though, makes me really not want to use it too much. Though this issue isn't nearly as severe as the super missile combos in this game. The Sunburst, Dark Burst, and Sonic Boom all look really cool, but they're all somehow even less useful than Prime 1's missile combos. I don't think it'd be too damning an issue on its own, if I'm being honest, but the problem is that they just consume an obscene amount of beam ammo. As a result, I only really found myself using the Sunburst just to kill the Dark Commandos slightly faster. I don't really have much more to say, I just really dislike the missile combos in this game. And the screw attack is fine. I don't have anything else to say about that. Right, I think that has bought me enough time to 100% complete the game. Let's get back to the end game, shall we? Prime 1, as we all know, has a rather infamous artifact hunt, which, while the criticism is well-deserved, the execution is somehow even worse in Prime 2 with its Sky Temple key hunt, if you can believe that. Like, god, fuck the Sky Temple key hunt. Sure, in Prime 1 it would be possible to come across artifacts as you went along, but Prime 2 locks them behind the Dark Visor, which you don't get until you're in the last third of the game. It's not as if the keys aren't alluded to before. You can come across corpses labeled as key bearers throughout the game, which allude to the locations of the keys, but until you have the Dark Visor, this information does nothing for you. You can make a mental note of it, sure, but even if you don't, you'll eventually hit a wall near the end of the game that'll direct you to find the corpses anyway. Thankfully, the keys are relatively easy to find, but making them impossible to acquire until you're nearing the end of the game just feels like a huge misstep, and I don't feel like the game ever really recovers from it. Though, if you're after 100% completion, it is a good excuse to go re-explore old areas. Though 100%ing does have a bit of an issue in this game, more so than Prime 1. It still has all the benefits I mentioned in the Prime 1 critique, such as telegraphed visuals and audio cues in the environment. The issue in Prime 2 isn't really an issue of design, so much as a necessary consequence of the Dark World mechanics. It makes remembering where every item is more difficult. It still is fun to acquire all of them, I have to admit, but I don't think the payoff is worth it this time around, and we'll get to that. With the Sky Temple keys collected, it's time to go into the final fight against the Emperor Eng to reclaim the remaining entirely renewable resource of Aether. The Sky Temple itself isn't much to write home about, but it's a serviceable arena for what is admittedly a pretty awesome and well fleshed out fight. If Quadraxis is my favorite, which it is, the Emperor Eng is a damn close second. Though I feel the experience of fighting it is more clunky than any of the earlier Guardian fights. The first phase of the Emperor is by far the worst in my opinion, taking on the form resembling a colossal anglet. This phase is a combination of playing jump rope with its whips while simultaneously trying to shoot them off to reveal the boss's weak point. It's simple enough, but trying to maintain lock-on the whips while it's trying to spin around and hit you makes it really difficult to hit the whips with any accuracy. It's just clunky, but never unmanageable. This form is at least aesthetically pleasing, though I suppose the same could be said for all of the other forms as well. Phase 2 caught me completely off guard if I'm being honest. A full-on morph ball battle where the floor is poison. There's not much to it. Bomb the openings and don't fall about sums it up, but it certainly left an impact. The most iconic form of the Emperor is of course the third form that resembles the Warrior Ring. Functionally, the fight is a lot like the Metroid Prime fight from the end of the first game, albeit taken out of its linear hallway. It still revolves around using the right beam at the right time. The circular arena certainly makes maneuvering around the Emperor's attacks slightly more interesting than the Metroid Prime, but the main downside of the Emperor is that I often found that its central limb frequently blocked attacks directly at its core, even if they were fired at point-blank range. The defeat of the Emperor Eng is less explosive than its Prime 1 counterpart, admittedly, but it does lead into a surprise escape sequence from the collapsing Dark Aether, into an even more surprising encounter with Dark Samus on your way out. Now, for the most part, the Dark Samus fights in this game have only had minor changes, so I didn't really have much to say about them, and that also kind of includes this one, at least for the first phase. The most striking change is obviously Dark Samus's appearance, which looks rad and unsettling in equal measure. It also hopefully drives home that Dark Samus's true nature is that it's the Metroid Prime from the end of the last game after having stolen Samus's Phazon suit, indicated by Dark Samus's left hand bearing the eye. So I guess, in a way, this means that both Prime 1 and 2 end with a fight against the titular creature. That aside, this fight does at least one thing that's interesting. You actually have to utilize the power beam to absorb the loose Phazon launched by Dark Samus to fire back at her to deal damage. Given this is the only way to deal real reliable damage and the fight is on a timer, it really raises the tension of this fight as a whole, and I can't say I dislike it. Naturally, our hunter defeats the evil doppelganger and escapes the collapsing dimension. And there's this nice little touch to the scene where you can see the claws of the Aang trying to escape to freedom. With that, Samus returns the Light of Aether and leaves with a backhanded wave to the Umos and their 8 newly awakened brethren. If you've 100% completed the game, you get a perhaps unsurprising scene of Dark Samus reforming in outer space from the remnants of Phazon that seem to have escaped the collapsing Dark Aether. Or maybe this is one of those SAX situations where there's multiple of them. Who can say? And with that, Prime 2 is complete. Admittedly, I had a really good time with this one. Given my lack of history with it, I thought for sure I wouldn't have much to say, but here we are. The game has great level design, a far more cohesive storyline than its predecessor, and much more engaging boss encounters. It's undoubtedly a massive improvement on the foundation that Prime 1 had laid out. But I don't think I can wholeheartedly recommend playing this title. At the very least, not the GameCube version. It's sort of like getting into Majora's Mask. It's not really for everyone, and at times it can feel like you're beating your head against a wall trying to get into the game's rhythm. In a lot of ways, Prime 2 is as divisive as Aether itself, but I think it is definitely worth trying. But just temper your expectations. It's got a lot of flaws, but I think they're a part of the game's charms. Except Lower Torvus Bog, which is objectively awful as a pace breaker. But hey, it's a small price to pay for Sanctuary Fortress in my opinion. I don't really know what else I can say. It exceeded my expectations, and I'll be curious to see if Prime 3, which was previously my favorite entry in the trilogy, can still hold that place. And I hope y'all will find out with me, and also that you enjoyed this video. And hey, I have a playlist of all of my previous Metroid videos from when this channel began. Feel free to go check it out. I hope this video lit a fire under you, and once again, I will see you next mission.